The first frost of the season had silvered the windows of Aldenmere Hall, and in the cold blue hour before the household woke, Hester Pell was already on her knees at the great hearth, raking the dead ashes into a pail. She was the under-housekeeper, 24 years old, with chapped hands and a plain gray gown that had been turned twice at the cuffs. And she had learned long ago to move through the great rooms as though she were a draft and not a person. The butler watched her from the doorway. He was an old man named Mr. Goss. Narrow and upright, his coat brushed to a shine no servant's coat had any right to hold, and he had served the Earls of Aldenmere for 40 years. He watched her the way a man watches a clock he has decided not to trust. "You linger in the library," he said, his voice dry, as the ash she swept. "A girl of your station has no business with the books. See that you forget the way to that room." She did not answer him. She had learned that too. Her hand, though, where it gripped the iron rake, went white at the knuckle, because the library was the one room in that house where she could still feel the shape of the life she had lost, and she did not think she could forget the way to it if she tried for the rest of her years. Stay with me, because the girl, raking ashes in that cold blue hour, was about to be seen by the one man in England who could not afford to see anyone at all. Leave a quiet word below if you have ever been told to forget a room you loved. To the house, Hester was nobody. She had come to Aldenmere 18 months before, with one trunk and a letter of character, and the letter had not said that her father had once been a country clergyman with a study full of books, nor that she had read Latin at his knee before she was 12, nor that the living had died with him and the debts had eaten the rest. The letter had said she was clean, sober, and willing, and that was all a servant was permitted to be. The housekeeper above her, Mrs. Larch, called her capable, in the same tone she might have called a kettle capable. The footman did not call her anything. She was a pair of hands that arrived before dawn, and a gray shape that withdrew after dark, and the only person in that house who spoke to her, as though she had a mind behind her eyes, was a man she had not yet properly met, the master himself, who had been abroad for the better part of her service, and was expected home within the week. The master was Julian Hart, the 7th Earl of Aldenmere, and the household spoke of him in lowered voices. He was 32, and he had come into the title 4 years past under a shadow that no one named aloud. There had been a younger brother. There had been a matter on the continent, in the last hard year of the war that had ended with the brother dead, and the Earl returned alone and gone to stone. The servant said he did not laugh. The servant said he kept a room at the top of the east wing locked, and that Mr. Goss alone held the key, and that whatever was in it was the reason his lordship's face had set the way a river sets under ice. Hester did not trade in such talk. She had dusted the locked door once, though, on a morning when she lost her way, and she had felt the cold come off it like breath, and she had not forgotten that either. The library was her secret. In the dead hour before the house woke, when even Goss had not yet risen to inspect the silver, she would slip into that long candle-lit room with its shelves climbing floor to ceiling, and she would take down a volume and read 3 pages by the gray window light, and then she would put it back exactly as it had stood. It was theft of a kind, she knew. It was the only thing she had ever stolen. She told herself it harmed no one, that a book read at dawn was none the worse for it, and she went on telling herself so, even after the morning Mr. Ombon. Goss found her there with Herodotus open on her knee, and told her, in that dry 40-year voice, that a creature like her had no business with a gentleman's books, and had best forget the way. That had been the first time the word was spoken. Creature. He had said it softly, almost kindly, the way one corrects a child. And the kindness had been worse than the cruelty would have been, because it meant he believed it. To Goss, who had served 2 earls, and meant to die in the 3rd one's service, Hester Pell was a creature who had got above herself, and the library was a door that had to be shut. She shut it. She kept shutting it for a fortnight. And then the Earl came home. He arrived in the rain, after dark, with no warning sent ahead, and the whole house was thrown into a scramble of lit candles and hurried boots. Hester was carrying linen along the upper gallery when the doors below were opened and the cold, wet night came in, and she stopped at the balustrade without meaning to, and looked down. He stood in the entrance hall, shaking the rain from a dark traveling coat, tall and broad through the shoulder, his black hair wet to his collar, his face turned up toward the light of the great chandelier. For one moment she saw it plainly. That famous, frozen face. The jaw like something carved, and the gray eyes that did not seem to expect anything good of the world. Then his gaze lifted further, past the candles, and found her at the rail. She should have moved. A servant caught looking was a servant out of place. She did not move, and for the length of a breath neither did he, and something passed across that still face that she could not name. A kind of arrest, as though he had seen not a gray shape on a staircase but a particular person he had not been warned to expect. Then Mr. Gosse was at his elbow with the candle and the murmured welcome, and the Earl's eyes came away from her, and she carried her linen on, with her heart going hard against her stays. For no reason, she would admit. What she did not know, what no one in that house knew but two men, was that the Earl of Aldenmere had not come home to rest. He had come home to catch a traitor, and the only servant he had been told to watch was the one who knew every locked door in the place. The next morning she learned the shape of the new household by its sounds. There was a different tread on the stairs. Slow and even and unhurried. A man who had never in his life needed to hurry. There was the Earl's voice, low and level from behind the study door, and Gosse's voice, answering, smooth as poured cream. And there was twice that day a silence that fell whenever she entered a room, where the two of them stood together. The particular silence of a conversation, folded away at the sight of a servant. She thought nothing of it. Servants were furniture, and gentlemen spoke freely before furniture. It did not occur to her that anyone in that house might be watching her with the same care she took to remain unseen. It was the child who broke the ice. The Earl had a ward, a small grave boy of 7 called Tom, the orphan son of a dead friend, and Tom had been left mostly to a nursemaid and the wide, cold rooms, and Tom did not speak. He had not spoken, the kitchen said, since he came to Aldenmere a year before. He drifted through the lower passages like a small ghost, and the servants pitied him and let him be. And the Earl, when he was home, would stand in the nursery doorway and look at the boy, and not know what to do with his own hands. Hester found Tom one afternoon at the foot of the library steps, staring up at the shelves with a hunger she knew in her own bones. She should have sent him to his nurse. Instead, she sat down on the cold step beside him, and took down a book of voyages with a map of the whole known world folded inside it, and began, very quietly, to read aloud. She did not hear the door. She did not know that the Earl had come to the library for a paper and stopped at the threshold and gone still, that he stood in the shadow of the doorway and watched a gray-gowned servant trace a coastline with her finger while a boy, who had not spoken in a year, leaned his whole small weight against her arm. She read on, her voice low and warm, naming the islands and the strange seas, the long blue stretches of water and the small green specks of land scattered across them like crumbs, and Tom listened with his lips parted and his eyes following her finger as it moved across the folded map. She paused over a name she could not pronounce and made a small game of it, sounding the strange syllables wrong on purpose, and the boy's mouth twitched. Not yet a smile, but the country a smile would come from, and she felt the warmth of his small shoulder come to rest against her arm. She did not press him to speak. She had learned in her own grief that some silences are not empty, but full, and that a person sitting quietly beside another is sometimes the whole of what can be offered. So she only read, and turned the pages slowly, and let the boy lean. Tom's hand crept into hers and held it, the small cold fingers closing tight, and the Earl of Aldenmere stood in the dark of the doorway, and did not breathe. When at last she sensed something and looked up, he was already gone, and yet the book trembled in her hands, and she could not have said why. That was the witnessing, though she would not understand it for a long while. The man whose face was set like ice had seen her do the one thing his own grief could not do, and he had carried the sight of it away with him into the locked rooms of himself. He began, after that, to appear where she was. It was nothing she could name and nothing she could refuse. She would be carrying coal to the morning room and find him already there at the window, and he would say, without turning, "Set it down and warm yourself a moment before you go." She would be on the back stair with an armful of dried lavender. He would be coming down and would stop and stand aside and wait, gravely, as though she were a lady and not a girl with cracked hands, until she had passed. Once she dropped a candlestick in the gallery, and the crash brought him out of the study, at a stride she had not known that slow man owned, and when he saw it was only brass and not bone, he stood over her with his jaw working, and said low and rough, "You will tell me at once if anyone in this house frightens you." She did not understand him. She thought he meant the work. She did not yet know that he had spent 4 years learning to read a room for danger, and that the danger he had been sent to find wore a brushed coat and held a ring of keys. The orders had come to him from London from a grey office near the Horse Guards in a letter he had burned. The night he read it, somewhere in the Earl's own household, the letter said, a man had been selling secrets through the long years of the war. Dispatches and troop movements and the names of agents, passed out of great houses where great men spoke too freely. The traitor had a code name and no face. He had cost lives. He had, the letter said with terrible delicacy, very likely cost the life of a young officer on the continent 4 years past, an officer whose movements had been known to the enemy before he made them. The young officer had been the Earl's brother, and the one clue London had was that the cellar knew the inside of Aldenmere Hall as only a long servant could, every locked door, every hidden stair, every paper left on a desk. The Earl had read that, and gone very quiet, and he had not slept, and he had come home to watch his own people with the eyes of a hunter. And the first name his man in London had set before him, the servant who moved through every room and lingered, by Mr. Goss's own report in the library where the master's papers lay, was Hester. She felt the watching without understanding it. The Earl's grey eyes followed her now, and she read in them the coldness everyone spoke of and told herself. It was contempt. That a girl who had been caught reading above her station was being marked for dismissal. Her wound spoke to her in her father's absence, and the cold of the turned cuffs and the word Goss had used. Creature. Of course, the Earl despised her. Men of his rank did not look twice at a grey shape on a staircase, except to find fault. She bent her head lower and worked harder, and waited for the blow to fall, and all the while the man was watching her, not with contempt, but with a question he could not yet answer, because the traitor he sought did not read aloud to a silent child, as though the child were the only soul in the house worth saving. Here is the thing about a house with a secret in it. The secret presses on everyone, and the innocent feel the pressure as guilt, and the guilty feel it as opportunity. Mr. Goss felt it as opportunity. He had served 2 masters, the old Earl and the new, and he had served a third, the old Earl never knew of, a paymaster across the water, who had wanted only the contents of certain dispatch boxes, and had paid in gold that Goss had told himself year on year he took only against the indignity of his age. He had grown careful and old and certain of himself, and the one thing that frightened him now was the new Earl's stillness, the way the master's grey eyes had begun to move about the household like a hand searching a dark drawer. Goss was too clever to be caught in the open. So he did what clever, guilty men have always done. He found a creature to carry the guilt for him. He began with words. In the housekeeper's room over the evening tea, in the hearing of 2 upper servants, he let fall that he had found Miss Pell in the master's library again, among the very papers, and had wondered aloud, in his dry, kind voice, what a clergyman's ruined daughter might do with letters she had no business reading. "A girl who reads Latin," he said, turning his cup, "is a girl who reads what she is shown and what she is not. One wonders where it goes. That was the second voicing. It went out from that room into the corridors, and down to the kitchens, the way such things do. And by week's end, the household had decided that the quiet under-housekeeper had a sly look about her after all. She felt the temperature of the house change toward her, and did not know why. The footman's silence grew teeth. Mrs. Larch watched her over the linen press, and the Earl, who heard everything in that house because Mr. Row. Goss made certain he heard. It was given the report he had been primed to expect, that Miss Pell had been at the dispatch box, that Miss Pell received letters she burned, that Miss Pell was not what her plain gown pretended. Goss laid it before him like a good and grieving servant laying down a painful duty, and watched the master's face for the relief of a hunter who has been handed his quarry. But the face did not relieve. The Earl heard the report in silence, and then he asked one question very quietly. "When you found her in the library," he said, "what was she reading?" And Goss, who had not expected the question, said the first thing that came to him, that he had not marked the title, that it was some book or other, and the Earl looked at him for a long moment and said nothing more. And Mr. Browl. Goss left the study with the first cold thread of fear working through his certainty, because a guilty servant always remembers the title of the book he uses to damn someone, and an honest accuser would have known. That night the Earl did a thing no one saw. He went up to the locked room at the top of the east wing, the one whose key Goss held, and he found the key gone from the board where the household keys hung. And he stood in the dark before that locked door for a long time. Behind it were his brother's effects, sent home from the continent in a single trunk, and among them the last letters his brother had written, and the Earl had locked them away because he could not bear them, and had given the only key to the one servant he had been raised to trust without question. He understood, standing there in the cold, that he had given the keys of his whole grief to a man he had never once thought to watch. The wound in him had a name, and he had spent 4 years refusing to say it. His brother's name was Edmund. Edmund had been the warm one, the one who laughed, the one who had gone to the war because Julian could not be spared from the estate, and Edmund had died in a ditch, on a road the enemy should not have known he would travel. The Earl had carried the guilt of that ditch, the way a man carries a stone in his chest, certain it was his own fault for letting his brother go in his place. He had been the elder, the steady one, the one the estate could not spare, and he had stood in the courtyard 4 years past and watched Edmund swing up onto the horse with that easy grace and that ready laugh and ride out toward a war that took him in a season. The last letter had come folded small, full of jokes about the rations and a line at the end about coming home by the spring, and the spring had brought instead a single trunk and a sword and a captain's awkward condolences. Julian had locked the trunk away because he could not read past that final line, and he had not opened it since. Now he stood before a locked door with the key missing, and felt the stone shift, and understood for the first time that the road might have been known to the enemy, not by chance, but by sale, and that the man who sold it might be sleeping that very hour under his own roof. The next morning he came to find her. She was in the morning room banking the fire, and he stood in the doorway until she felt him there, and turned, and he looked at her with something in his frozen face that had cracked open in the night. "Miss Pell," he said, and his voice was not cold, "I am told you read Latin." She went still, the poker in her hand, certain the blow had come at last. She lifted her chin and answered him plainly, because she had decided she would not lie to save herself. The dismissal she could not escape. "My father was a clergyman, my lord. He taught me before he died. I read his books because they are the only thing of his I have left. And I have read yours because they are the same books. And I am sorry for the theft of it, but I cannot be sorry I read them." It was the most she had said to anyone at Aldenmere in 18 months. And when it was done, she waited for him to call her insolent. He did not. He crossed the room and stood close to her, closer than a master stood to a servant, and she felt the heat come up her throat and was furious at her own body for betraying her, because her mouth had just told him the truth, and her pulse was telling him something else entirely, and she could not call either of them back. He looked down at her for a long moment. "Do not be sorry," he said low. "Sit down. You have been standing since before light." It was an order. It was the gentlest thing anyone had said to her in years. Folded inside an order, and she sat down because her knees had gone unreliable. He did not move away. He stood near her chair with his hands clasped behind him, looking down at the cracked skin of her knuckles where the cold and the lie had worked at them, and a muscle shifted along his jaw. "Your hands," he said, and stopped, as though the rest of the sentence had cost more than he was prepared to spend. She drew them into her lap, ashamed, and he said, lower still, "You need not hide them from me." She lifted her eyes to his, then because no one of his rank had ever spoken to her hands as though they were hers and not merely tools, and she found him watching her with a steadiness that made the warmth climb higher in her face. She was aware of exactly where he stood, of the breadth of him between her and the window, of the slow, even sound of his breathing, and she could not look away, and could not have said why she did not wish to. He stood over her like a man guarding a fire from the wind, and neither of them spoke. And the room was very warm and very quiet, and somewhere in that silence the thing between them stopped being deniable to anyone but her. You've seen by now where her heart was going, even as her mind refused the road she had not. Stay close for the turn, and tell me below if you have ever known a thing in your body long before you would let yourself believe it. He set himself to learn the truth of her after that, and the learning of it undid the rest of his coldness piece by piece. He found that she rose before the house to read, because the reading was the last thread to her father. He found that the dispatch box she was said to haunt stood in a room she was forbidden to enter, and that her dawn library was 3 doors distant. He found, when he asked the nursemaid, that the silent boy Tom now waited each afternoon at the foot of the library steps for a gray-gowned woman who read him the names of islands, and that the child had begun, in the last fortnight, to whisper those names back. The Earl stood in the nursery doorway that evening and watched his ward mouth the word archipelago against Hester's sleeve. And the stone in his chest moved again, and he understood that the creature Mr. Esty, Goss had taught the house to fear, was the only person in it who had reached the boy. His own grief could not. Goss saw the master softening, and knew his hour had come to strike or be struck. He made his move with a cold competence of a man who had evaded capture for 10 years. He took a packet of letters, copies in a disguised hand of true dispatches he had sold long ago, and he put them where a guilty servant would hide them, behind the loosened panel in the under-housekeeper's narrow room. And then he went to the Earl with his grieved face, and said he could keep the painful secret no longer. That he had seen Miss Pell at the dispatch box with his own eyes the night before, that the household's whispers were true, and the master must act before more harm was done. Dadder. And to seal it he said the word a 3rd time. In the open now, before Mrs. Larch and a footman, summoned to witness, that it grieved him to see the house deceived by such a creature, and that he had taken the liberty of searching her room, and that what he had found there would break his lordship's heart. They went up together, the whole grim procession, Mr. Goss leading with a candle, and his bowed, grieving head, Mrs. Larch behind with her keys, the footman last and unwilling. The narrow room at the top of the servants' stair was barely wider than the bed it held, and it had never in 18 months felt small until that night when 5 people crowded into its cold, and the candlelight threw their shadows huge against the bare wall. Goss went to the loosened panel as a man goes to a thing he has known the location of all along, and his fingers found the edge of it without searching, and he drew it back. The letters were there. He lifted them out and held them up to the light, packet upon packet of close disguised script, and laid them on the coverlet as though laying out a corpse. Hester stood in the cold doorway of her own room and watched the proof of a crime she had never committed spread across her own narrow bed. The footman would not look at her. Mrs. Larch's mouth was a hard line. And Mr. Goss stood at the master's shoulder, with his head bowed in sorrow. And Hester understood, with the clean, terrible clarity of the falsely accused, exactly what had been done to her, and exactly how little her truth would weigh against it. She had no father to vouch for her. She had no character. But a letter that said she was willing. She was a clergyman's ruined daughter, found with stolen secrets behind her wall. And there was not a court in England that would hear her over the word of a butler with 40 years of service and an earl's trust. She did not weep, and she did not plead. She looked at the letters, and then she looked at the earl, and she said the one thing she had, which was the truth, plainly. "I did not put those there, my lord, and I never touched your brother's papers. I have stolen 3 pages of Herodotus at a time, and put them back. And that is the whole of my crime. And you may turn me out for it, but I will not own to murder. I did not do murder." The word fell into the room because she had understood at last what the secrets had cost. That letters sold were lives spent, and she would not have it said she had spent them. Then she stood waiting to be cast into the winter road, and behind her in the doorway, unseen by all of them, a small grave boy who had followed the noise upstairs, began for the first time in a year to cry aloud, because they were sending away the only person who had ever read to him. It was the dark hour, and it would have ended her but for 2 things. The guilty man had not counted on. He had not counted on the Earl knowing the title of every book in his own library. And he had not counted on the child finding his voice. The Earl looked at the letters a long time. Then he picked one up and read it, and his face did not change, but Hester, who had learned to read that frozen face better than she knew, saw the cold come into it that she had seen only once on the night he arrived in the rain. He set the letter down. "These are copies," he said very quietly. "To the room the originals were sold from this house during the war while this woman was a child in a country parsonage. Whoever wrote these fair copies wrote them to be found." He turned, slow and even. The unhurried tread the whole house knew, and he looked at his butler of 40 years. "You told me you did not mark the book she read," he said. "But you searched her room for letters tonight, and went straight to the panel. A man finds quickly what he himself has hidden, and Mr. Pryatt." Goss, who had served 2 masters and betrayed them both, opened his dry mouth and found, for the first time in 40 years, that he had nothing smooth to say. The reckoning came 2 days later, and the Earl made it where the wound had been made, in the great hall before the assembled household, because a creature accused in the open must be cleared, in the open or the clearing means nothing. He had sent to London in the night, and the grey man from the Horse Guards had come, and there were papers now in an honest hand that traced 10 years of gold into one account and one name. Mr. Goss stood in the center of the hall he had ruled for 4 decades, very upright still, his brushed coat catching the light, and he watched his certainties come apart in measured sentences he could not interrupt. Mrs. Pramin. Larch's hand had gone to her mouth, and her eyes, when they found Hester across the hall, held something that had not been there before. A slow, dawning shame at her own quick judgment. The footmen stood like stones. The kitchen maids who had whispered in the passages now studied the floor. And Hester stood at the side, in her turned grey gown, hearing the gold traced from box to box, and name to name, not yet daring to understand that she had been delivered, and the Earl finished with the London man, and then he turned from the whole grim apparatus of the law, and crossed the hall to her, 3 even strides. And in front of every soul who had called her a creature, he took her cracked hand in both of his. The hall went utterly silent. Mr. Goss's careful face was coming apart now, fold by fold. And into that silence the Earl said the thing that ended it. "This is the woman my brother died for. She stays." He had not meant it as the household first heard it, and yet it was true in every way it could be true. She was the woman whose innocence his brother's death had finally uncovered, and she was the woman he had decided. Somewhere between the rain and the reading, he would not lose. The two truths stood together in the one short sentence and could not be pulled apart. Mrs. Larch made a small broken sound. The footman who would not look at her now could not look away. And Mr. Maudible. Goss, stripped at last of the 40 years and the brushed coat and the smooth voice, was led out of the hall he had served and betrayed, an old man whose long, clever script had worked in every house in England except this one, and the great doors closed behind him on the silence he left. Then there was a small sound at the edge of the hall, and Tom came out from behind the housekeeper and crossed the cold floor, and put his hand into Hester's, and said clear and certain, in a voice the house had not heard in a year, "Do not send her away." The Earl knelt down on the stone before his ward, there in front of everyone, and put his hand on the boy's dark head, and his frozen face had broken entirely now, and he said, "No, I will not." And the household that had decided she was sly and a creature and not what her gown pretended, stood and watched their cold master kneel on the floor of his own hall, with a servant's hand in his and a child's hand in hers, and they understood, all at once and together, how wrong a whole house can be. By the first true snow, she was no longer the under-housekeeper. The banns were read in the village church where her father might have stood, and the season's gossip ran hot, and then, as gossip does, ran warm. For there is nothing England loves so well as a cold, proud man brought gently to his knees by a clergyman's daughter who reads Latin. The gossip is not where the story ends, though. The story ends in the library, in the dead blue hour. She had once crept through like a draught on an evening when the snow was falling thick past the tall windows and the candles were lit and the fire was high. She sat in the great chair that had once been forbidden her, with the book of voyages open on her knee and the map of the whole known world folded inside it. And Tom leaned his weight against her arm, and traced a coastline with his finger, and named the islands aloud, every one, in the voice he had found again. The Earl stood at the window with his back to the dark glass, watching the two of them in the warm light, and his face, that the whole county had once called carved from ice, was the face of a man thawed clean through. On the small table at her elbow stood the only thing she had carried into that house, and meant to carry out of it, a worn miniature of a country clergyman with kind eyes, set now where the firelight could reach it, no longer hidden in a trunk. She had stopped creeping. She had stopped sweeping ash before the light. She read aloud in the room she had been told to forget, in the house that was now her home. And outside the snow came down over the gray stone and the bare trees, and covered all of it soft and white and whole. Tom finished the islands and was quiet, and the fire settled, and Hester closed the book and laid her hand over the small painted face of her father where it caught the light. Thank you for staying to the end of her story. If Hester's quiet courage moved you, leave a word below with the moment that stayed with you, and I will see you in the next one.